So this movie is about some of the common problems that beginners face when learning how to use the pottery wheel. Nearly all of these problems kind of go away with a good wedging technique that mixes up the clay really thoroughly. So this clay it's harder on one side and softer on the other. If you're wedging properly, you shouldn't be adding in a whole bunch of air holes, and all of that should go away. And then one of the biggest mistakes that I really see people doing is that when they're handling the clay, they have wet hands. And you see that it's like I always will have dry hands. So if you start handling the clay with your wet, sticky hands, you get a layer of slip all over it, and now the thing's just going to slide around. So whenever you're handling clay, keep your hands dry. So quickly dry off the bottom here. You can have a little bit of water between the two of them, but if the clay itself is sticky or slippery, then it will slip off. So another thing is that if you're working on these bats, there's a tendency, if they don't get put on really well, there'll be a wobble to them. And that causes another kind of problem, because when if you have your hands pushed down to the bat, but it's wobbling, you're never going to get things to be perfectly level because there's a wobble on the bat. If you're having trouble when you're throwing the piece and the bat starts rising up, I put a little bit of clay underneath here, a ring of clay, setting it down so that it kind of acts like a suction cup, and should make so I always make sure that the bat's actually really down quite firmly, check to make sure that it feels level before I even start to throw. So this clay's going to have all kinds of problems with it, but it's 3 pounds of clay, and I'll try to make as best cylinder I can. Starting with this centering process, the coning up. It's not really centering the clay so much as just getting it coned up and then coming down and centering it. As I push it down, those pockets of air should start showing up pretty soon. And what I can kind of do to get rid of some of them will be because I can feel if there's air in there. And so pushing it, when I start to do this, it's kind of like a wheel wedging process. There goes an air bubble. And when you've got these, I can also feel it's never going to get perfectly centered because of the problems that came about because I didn't wedge the clay. But when I feel like I've got it good enough here, coming in and starting to finish off and open up the clay here. And then one of the common problems I see is when people start to open it up, they'll try to pull it open with both hands. And that's really not necessary. What you really want to be doing is just pushing down on one side and letting the wheel do the work. So pushing it down, opening up the clay. There comes another air bubble. Pop. Pop, pop, pop. So in the beginning, when you're centering and opening up the clay, when you come across an air bubble, you can kind of just force it out with just some pressure. And what I'll kind of do is just kind of pinch it and move the clay around, and eventually the air bubble will come to the surface and pop itself. And then that nicely fills back up with the clay. So in my opinion, if I come across an air bubble while centering or opening, I don't really worry about it too much. It's not really a problem. Here I'm compacting the bottom quite thoroughly. I can still feel that there's some more air bubbles in here. They might cause a little bit of problem. What really happens is that the fact that the clay wasn't wedged meant that one side's just a little bit harder, which means it won't respond to the same pressure. So the clay isn't going to be responding evenly to any given force that I put onto it. And that's going to cause it to become less and less centered as I go along. So coming in for this first pull, just kind of even it up, get some more water, and then pulling, and I actually do more and more of my pulls from the inside, kind of pushing the clay upward into that kind of inward cone when I'm trying to make a cylinder. So first pull, all of the problems of the clay don't really show up in the first pull. Some of them might show up in the second pull. Even that's still not too bad. And so third pull here, try to start getting some torsion in this as well, because that's a common thing that people come across. Oops, tore apart. So it came from pushing just a little bit too hard. The clay just rips apart. It's basically a worse version of torsion, and it actually happened so fast that I didn't even expect it to happen. So count that one down as a failure. And just have to clean up. Okay. Try again. Well, that wasn't the problem I was trying to demonstrate. So I have to try again now, I guess. So quickly go through the centering process. Working with unwedged clay is, it has more problems. And so I will largely blame that tearing apart on not being wedged. I was trying to push a little bit too hard so I'd start getting torsion. No, it's okay. So, one of the other subtle things is that in making your first cylinders, if you open it up a little bit wider, it will be a little bit easier to do the pulling steps. Because the wider circle is just a little bit stronger. So I'm still just kind of working through the bubbles and stuff that I added in. On each one of these steps I come back and as much as possible try to clean up the rim, compact the rim. If the rim stays in really good shape, then there's a lot fewer problems that will happen. So as you work along, try to keep that rim really thin, or really thick, sorry. And I was just thinking I should thin it out so that I'll have more problems. So I usually stop somewhere right around there, but if you keep going up, it'll thin out the rim. And it'll be a problem. So now there's something along here. I usually recommend stopping at 3 pulls, because that's about the number that you need to get really good beneficial work out of it. And going further, it thins it out just a little bit too much. And most of the time you don't get much more height. You start seeing a little bit more of these kind of the torsion problems, the clay starting to wobble a little bit more as I get it up taller. Most of the time I would try to kind of come in and correct that as soon as possible. I'll get it a little bit worse here first. Try not to rip it in half, that's not what I want. And see, it's not starting to wobble around a little bit more. And one of the ways to kind of counteract that a little bit is, first of all, just always holding your hands really, really steady so that you don't kind of give into the wobble. Because if you start wobbling with the clay, it will get worse and worse and really, really fast. One of the other troubles with throwing taller pieces is that you have to keep your arm from hitting this top rim. So if you're working on something that's really tall, you have to keep your arm really steady, because as soon as you start holding your arm against that rim, it's going to start wobbling the base a little bit more. So I can fix this up in a couple different ways. One, making sure to keep my arm away from hitting the rim, and just kind of gently pressing the clay to the outside. And if I work from the bottom upward in the shaping process, and I kind of can reshape it back to a round shape, it won't always lose any height, but it also gets a little bit weaker. And so sometimes if you come back down this other direction and go from the top to the bottom, it compacts the clay a little bit, making the clay a little bit stronger. So you can see now that this bottom part's starting to get a little bit stronger. And the top part is still kind of wobbling around chaotically. But if you solve the top problem first, and then the bottom problem, the top problem will come back. So kind of working their way from the bottom upward as much as possible. A lot of this top problem could actually be fixed just by keeping the rim of the piece really good. But I thinned it out a little bit more than I should have. I was also hoping to see a little bit more torsion. And torsion happens when your hands are pushing onto the piece, usually on the pulling steps, and you're pushing, or your hands are holding it just a little bit too much. So the clay needs to be sliding past your fingers, but if they start to catch a little bit, it will start to kind of hold on to the piece, and then the bottom will start to rotate around. But this piece doesn't seem to want to do that. I generally feel that torsion's one of the problems that happens on the lower portion of the clay. And if it's up near the top, it's more from the rippling of the curling, or rippling, or of tightening it up or collaring it in. So it'll start to look like that. It'll get kind of these pretty spirals going on. And if you keep working with them, most of the time, if you have a lot of control, then they could actually become really quite beautiful, spiraling all the way up. If you don't have that control, taking it, and you can smooth them out again with the rib by holding your hands as steady as possible and just gently pressing the clay and kind of working in the upward and then downward fashions a few times over, and they'll smooth it out. A lot of that structural problem will kind of also go away with it. The reason why we make cylinders still is that it's really hard to get the clay to kind of come back in. And so one of the other characteristics you'll start seeing is this piece is when they're thrown, will start to flare outward a little bit more than you might want them to. And so if you have your cylinder and it's flared outward, you probably saw me doing earlier, kind of the cheating step of collaring it in. And it'll take, one of the reasons I have big hands in pottery is that you take your hand all the way around it and it's kind of like throwing it, but collaring it all the way around. And if you go too fast or push it too hard, it'll start doing these ripples. And they're quite difficult to get rid of, except for by kind of coming in and doing another throwing step. And so most of the time, if you're collaring, you want to stop just before you start to see those ripples happen. So if you're collaring in, it's like, okay, now it's starting to ripple, I'll stop. And then do another kind of throwing type step before coming in and collaring it again. And if you get too far along, you can come in and snip off the entire piece. When I'm doing this, I found that it's best to holding the needle tool really steady. So I'll hold the needle tool with my right hand, and then with my left hand, come in and push the clay to the needle instead of moving the needle. I found that, at least for me, that makes a much better cut. I was expecting there to be some air bubbles along the way, but apparently I removed them all in the centering process. If there had been one, then I would have, again, taken the needle tool, and what I like to do with popping out air bubbles, like if there's a pretend one here, is I'll take and kind of push it in with my fingers and then give it the pop with the needle. That way I can kind of come in and smooth things out. And most of the time I won't add any more clay in, but if it's a really big one, take some of the clay from around here and find this spot. And I will dab in a little bit of clay, and then kind of mess up the entire area all around it, so that it's all kind of evenly bad before coming in and trying to fix that and smooth it out. And I found that if I do that, you can almost completely make them go away.